coming, and I'm just really excited to be with this good, wonderful group of women.
Woo!
All right, witch hunts. This is about witch hunts. It's about gender witch hunters and how do we fight back. It is indeed strange times we are living in. Even 5 or 10 years ago, I never would have imagined that I would be witch hunted out of a job that I'd held for 20 years and subsequently thrown out of a pro-Palestinian peace group for my feminist views that women are oppressed as a sex and for simply saying that I am a lesbian as it has always been defined. How is it that a regressive ideology that is fundamentally sexist and homophobic and that is preying on gender non-conforming minors, many young lesbians with experimental quasi-medical treatments to arrest any so-called incongruence between 1950s style sex roles and one sex body, how did it get such prominence all over the world? How did it co-opt the lesbian and gay rights movement after marriage equality was won? A struggle I helped to lead in San Diego. And how did it go on to erase sex-based rights, protections, and the ability to even talk about them that many of us took for granted? How did it come to be embraced not only by the neoliberal Democratic Party establishment, beholden to its corporate donors, but also by the tiny, marginal, far left, which I have my roots as a longtime socialist? And most importantly, how do we fight back? Witch hunts come in certain times in history, times of instability and scapegoating, times of irrational fear. Whether we're talking about the Salem witch hunts or the McCarthy era, they are desperate attempts to intimidate and silence and shore up the status quo. And so today's anti-feminist witch hunt, led by gender ideologues, it's the same thing. Now, a little about my story. There were signs of an increasing insanity at work and my own job around gender identity and denial of sex. And I was getting this sneaking feeling, the creepy feeling that I was being socially ostracized. We were at that time all working remotely, and it was really difficult to have a clear sense of how far down the rabbit hole things had gone. I had no idea, as I later learned, that my outside political activities were being investigated by a female trans-identified coworker who I had had no contact with whatsoever, and was apparently on a fellowship for some trans rights project. I had no idea that my comments made at a diversity training, and on one other occasion that my lesbianism was based on same sex, not same gender, whatever that means, attraction, was enough to convict me of transphobia, not just by one person or two people at work, but basically large numbers of coworkers and ultimately management. I had no idea that the witch hunters were already organizing themselves. That they had listened to my fizz tapes and my work defending the Georgia Green Party, it's all connected, and they were looking for an opportunity to strike at a moment's notice. They were already ready. And I didn't find this out until my lawsuit, in which you learn what's called discovery in lawsuits. And strike they did. On May 6, 2022, my liberal employer, Disability Rights California, issued a statement opposing the imminent reversal of Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision and welcomed feedback, welcomed it. The statement by DRC listed every single group imaginable that could be impacted by the ban against abortion, except women. So I politely responded, quote, "So glad DRC came up with a statement in defense of Roe. Thank you. Access to safe legal abortion is a life and death necessity for women as a biological sex across the board." And I gave, regardless of gender identity, regardless of race, regardless even of sexual orientation, a whole list. And then I said, an absolute prerequisite for equal female participation in society. Now, could you imagine that that was deemed hate speech? And the really bad words were biological sex. I was immediately called on the carpet for this benign statement about the importance of abortion rights to women. I had excluded other genders, trans men and non-binary, who also need abortions. My trans-identified co-worker called me a hate monger and a TERF. That's a bad word, so it's trans exclusionary radical feminist. Quote, she argues that trans people are not who we say we are. This is a dangerous, deceitful lie and results in serious violence and stigma against trans people. It's funny if it wasn't, it's funny. I know, it is. Statements from my FIST work were quoted out of context because they've been studying me and listening to my tapes. I tried to clarify I was talking about sex. Sex, you know what I mean? Sex, not gender. And that only females of the species can get pregnant. And I didn't do that, it's just part of nature. But that did nothing to assuage the witch hunters. In fact, there was clearly no way to discuss the category of sex without being deemed a bigot. All this occurred on a Friday. By the following Monday, I was condemned by my entire work group of civil rights lawyers. I later learned in discovery, in my lawsuit, that 15 people submitted a petition that same Monday, so they were ready for this, right? Same Monday, over the weekend, to the executive director demanding that I be fired, referring to my two sins, my comments on abortion and my lesbian sexuality. And of course, throwing in my outside political activity that just happens to be protected under California labor law. 2 days later, without warning, I was fired by text message. The witch hunt was merciless. My employer denied my unemployment because of my abusive nature. I had to wait 6 months because the goddamn state of California you have to wait to get a hearing. 6 months to win it back. Fortunately, I had started collecting Social Security. I had some savings. But if I was a younger person without those things, my liberal employer would have effectively thrown me out onto the streets. Then, a year and a half later, I found myself doing Palestinian solidarity work with Jewish Voice for Peace. I was doing peace work, and that's all I talked about was peace. The issue of gender identity had never come up. But, without warning, I was removed from the group and told I needed to recant my transphobic, quote-unquote, views that they had happened to discover on Twitter and on the FIST website. And if I didn't do that, I would be forbidden to participate in a peace event that I had helped organize. It was actually my idea, the event. And I would be effectively expelled because my very presence at a protest would harm our trans members. My very presence. And so they changed the location of the demonstration to make sure I didn't go.
That's so offensive.
God.
Yes, that's okay.
So offensive.
And it was secret, right? Ann?
So how do we fight back? I'm a witch, right? Evil eye. How do we fight back? Lawsuits are important tools. Though it wasn't easy, I found a lawyer willing to fight hard for me. We sued DRC for sex and sexual orientation discrimination and retaliation. We later added a cause of action for employer interference in my outside political activities, which, as I said, is protected under California law and the laws of some other states. Building broad political support and getting publicity for a lawsuit is also vital to help expose the injustice of the witch hunt. Similarly, gathering allies for one's democratic right to be in the broader movement. We belong in the left, we belong in these progressive movements. That is strategically necessary, whether we're talking about peace, environmental movements, labor movements, the Green Party, etc. I obtained a number of signatures on an open letter to Jewish Voice for Peace condemning my expulsion. The signers included two prominent leftist men, Chris Hedges and Dan Kavalik, who also wrote a book against cancel culture. Dan did. All of this type of fight back makes it much harder for the witch hunt to continue. As of course, what we're doing here this weekend, building our independent women's liberation movement that can help defeat this dangerous, regressive, reactionary ideology once and for all. Ultimately, the only way to stop a witch hunt is for enough people to speak out in opposition to it. When more and more people say, as Joseph Welch said to McCarthy in 1954, "Have you no sense of decency?" Only then will it end. In unity, there is strength. They can't fire all of us. This witch doesn't burn.